Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining this Saga Session. Today we are going to be discussing the 1999 film The Mummy, starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz. I am joined today by none other than my friend, the ancient Egyptian. I hope you guys enjoy. Welcome to Saga Sessions, a show where we explore, analyze, and discuss our favorite stories. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Adam, an ancient Egypt nerd who runs the YouTube channel The Ancient Egyptian. If you are into Egyptology, anything ancient Egypt related, I highly recommend you check this channel out. There are some great videos on there. Adam, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Anytime.
We're going to be discussing the 1999 Mummy film today, which you said, Adam, is your favorite film of all time. Is that correct?
I admit that it is correct. There has been some fierce competition in the last 26 years. But I would say that I think it still ranks up there as the perfect mix of adventure and thriller.
Fantastic. And before we dive into the film itself, I do want to bring up the fact that I have been reviewing Indiana Jones films for the last few months with my friend Nick, and upon rewatch of The Mummy this past week, I realized just how similar to an Indiana Jones flick this movie is, and it's really cool.
I think that the screenwriter for The Mummy, must have watched the Raiders of the Lost Ark and Temple of Doom multiple times, and they inserted different aspects into parts of the film. So just an example, when the city of Hamunaptra is set to sink into the sand dunes at the end of the film and the walls were closing, I am not sure you could get closer to a Temple of Doom reference than that, especially when he drops his hat and then he pulls it. But in this case, it was Benny that he couldn't pull through and he had to leave him. But I would be amazed if the screenwriter hadn't watched that film at least 5 times.
Yeah. You know, I was doing some reading on the history of production leading up to our recording, and this movie went through so many different, I don't want to use the term revisions necessarily because I don't think they wrote more than a couple of scripts. I could be mistaken in saying that, but based on what I've read, I think that is the case. But I think pre-production went back to as early as the 1980s, and they were trying to get a Mummy reboot off the ground for a while. And at one point, they said, hey, let's do a film set in modern day. And obviously, that didn't work out. We ended up with a film that took place in the 30s. It is the 30s. Am I correct?
It's the 20s.
The 20s. Okay, so just a little bit before Indiana Jones, because Indiana Jones takes place in the 30s, at least the first 3 films in the series. And I think ultimately we did get the modern take on the Mummy when they tried to do the Tom Cruise reboot, which that's probably a recording for another time. That's an interesting film.
I have far too much to say on that, which I really don't think we have the time.
We'll have to save that one for later. But the producers at Universal Studios ultimately settled on, a 1920s Indiana Jones-esque action film with a little bit of horror, a little bit of humor, well, more than a little bit of horror, but with horror, humor, and a great cast to tie everything together. We have Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, and John Hannah playing our big 3, the main characters, and they all do a fantastic job. I read that Rachel Weisz was actually not at the top of the list because the producers wanted to go with an American actress, but the director, Stephen Sommers, was just in awe of her audition that he called her back for a second one. And after the second audition, he was like, no, this is the actress for us. This is the person we want to go with. You are going to be our Evelyn. Just everything about her was what Stephen Sommers was looking for, and I think they cast her very well.
I agree.
But let's dive into the film. Do you have anything to say about the prologue of the film, Adam? I know that is the portion of the film that takes place in ancient Egypt, of which you are, a nerd, a self-professed nerd.
Yes, so I do want to start off to tell every single viewer that there are no pyramids in Thebes. There are pyramids in Cairo and there are pyramids around the country, mainly in the north. I am assuming that the director wanted to attach the most famous symbol of Egypt in the opening sequence. I get it, but I just want to reinforce that there were no pyramids in Thebes. But, I think that the architecture which they showed, the temples and the houses, which were a bit too close to the pyramid for my liking, I thought they were pretty good. And when the narrator says that Thebes was city of the living, that also was correct. Because in ancient Egypt, there was a belief that the East Bank, which is the side of the river that Thebes sits on, was the lands of the living, whereas the West Bank is the lands of the dead. That comes from the observation in Egyptian mythology of where the sun rises and the sun sets. The sun is born in the east and dies in the west, and so the dead were buried in cemeteries on the West Bank, and the living lived their lives on the East Bank. Anubis is the central god of the director and of the visual effects team, which is fine, but it wasn't really accurate. Anubis was the god of mummification. He wasn't a god that you saw every day.
So it sounds like that the filmmakers really wanted the audience to be able to kind of latch on to a familiar face, and the familiar face being Anubis, right?
Yes, because you see him on tomb walls, because that is most of what is left of ancient Egypt is tombs, and that is what we find most fascinating. And because of their fascination with death, we also have a fascination with death because of our fear of it. And so I would say that decision, I know it's been slated, but I think it's the correct decision because, as we were talking about before we started recording, I think that, and this is something which viewers need to bear in mind, a Hollywood movie is to entertain first, is to possibly educate second.
Right.
And so I think that needs to be remembered. But then moving on to the temple, you see lots of people walking around, you have stalls, you have children. It's a bit misleading because temples were, as you would consider churches or a Jewish temple or a Islamic mosque to be now, it's a place of worship, a place of reverence. What would happen? Most ordinary Egyptians would only be allowed in the temple courtyards. That's the outer courtyard, normally only at festival times or in important days. Beyond that, it would be a safe space for the priest to operate, which I think the film, I think it wants to portray the gods being a giant part of Egyptian life, which I think is fine, but there was a healthy separation. And so I think that takes us to actually see the characters. I think the decision to add body paint to the priests and Anaxunamun, did I say that right? I will probably get it wrong now about 5 more times.
Anaxunamun. Anaxunamun. Right. Yeah.
Anaxunamun. Got it. I think it's a creative choice, but not rooted in reality. Anyone who's been to Egypt knows just how much of a hot country it is. Very quickly, paint would run, but I think they get the idea from the shrouds that were left on corpses. So when a mummy was put into a coffin, above the bandages, they would place a shroud which... And if you imagine, just say that the Shroud of Turin, where there's the belief that the face of Jesus is on that shroud, the Egyptian version was actually similar. What would happen is that the person who had died, their image was drawn onto that as much as possible. Men in an orangey red colour, sometimes gold, and women were in yellow. So I am pretty sure there was some crossover there with the directing team. But I would say for their lack of dress, especially Anaxunamun, is that it wasn't unknown for Egyptians of both genders to walk around naked purely because of the heat.
Wow.
However, However, it would depend on who you were and where you were. But I think that is pretty accurate that their clothing is quite skimpy. But what they would wear, I think, is different to what is portrayed. They would wear white linen and not the dark colours that are portrayed here. In the sequel, when Rachel Weisz is Nefertiti, I think her costume is far better. At the time, the Egyptians weren't ones for dyes and staining their clothes, as linen was considered to be very expensive. So, yeah, I think the costume choice, well, I think it is in contrast to the gold setting of the palace, and that might be why. But most of the time, priests and princesses or mistresses would be dressed in white linen. Seti is an interesting choice for the pharaoh because he died mysteriously at 40 years old, or roughly that time. His mummy doesn't say how, which I think could explain why the writers chose that particular pharaoh.
I had no idea. That's fascinating.
I do want to make some criticisms over his costume choice. His crown is wrong. If he is in Thebes, he would have to either be wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, which has a red outline. And so the red band with the back, which is the version that Seti wore in the film, that's the crown of Lower Egypt, and it should be in red, not gold. Now, Lower Egypt consists of the Nile Delta in the north, probably all the way down to where modern-day Cairo is now. But in ancient times, Cairo used to be called Memphis, which was the city built by Egypt's first king to act as his capital after he united the country. So a pharaoh always ruled over two lands, never one. He always ruled two lands with equal respect, and ancient Egyptians identified with the land which they came from. So not quite the same, but imagine the American South and the North, not in the antagonistic sense, but in the identity sense.
Gotcha. Okay.
So if he's in the South, which Thebes is, so Thebes is about 300 plus miles from ancient Memphis, south. So he should have the white crown with the bulbous top, or he should have the double crown. And also, just a word on his palace. Egyptian palaces were never that tall, never that big, and definitely didn't have gold doors. The reason is because ancient Egyptian palaces were more often than not built out of mud, brick, and not stone. And so mud brick, you can't hold up very high ceilings, you can't have that level of decoration, and you certainly can't have gold doors that would probably pull the whole building down. They were always quite dark inside, and they were always quite confined. The rooms were normally 6x6, if that. Stone at the time was actually very expensive, and as a resource was 99.9% spent on monuments on the West Bank, because the Egyptians believed that a palace or a house was just a lifetime's investment, and given the average age or the average mortality when someone hit in their 40s back then,
right,
they didn't have the use of it for that long, whereas a stone monument was expected to last forever. So that is where the effort went.
Fascinating. So it sounds like, again, similar to what they did with Anubis, and you made this point earlier in the recording as well, Hollywood would rather entertain you than educate you, and they decided to go with a rather large set piece for the introduction of the film.
I totally agree. I think that most people who like ancient Egypt, or I'd say all people, I think they have a romantic view. And so they see it as an empire of scale. They see it as an empire of luxury. I've got to be honest as well. I think that there is a slight corruption in their view based on later Greek and Roman stone palaces as well, which I think can skew that, because the Egyptian palaces predated the Greek and Roman ones by about 1,000 years, if not more. But also, I think as well, the media depictions of Cleopatra, who was Greek Macedonian ruling Egypt, let's make that clear. She had grand monuments in Alexandria, which is the north of Egypt as well. So I think representation of architecture on screen, I think, took tremendous influence from the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra film during the 60s.
Right.
And there are some subsequent ones as well, of which I think the Mummy 1959 film as well, I think that depicted tombs quite well. Mm-hmm. And there are some more whose names escape me, but I think that the root of the influence for architecture was definitely in film rather than based on an Egyptologist feedback, in my view.
Gotcha. Well, that makes sense. It's quite a spectacle. It's a great set piece. It's Thebes, right, in the film, the city that we're introduced to. Yeah, it looks great. And we've mentioned Pharaoh Seti, Anaxunamun, but we haven't mentioned the mummy himself yet, Imhotep.
So I think the name is interesting, as he was in ancient Egypt considered a saint, and so it was a name of honor, and it was one associated with healing, with architecture, and of just being holy. He was a third dynasty vizier, which is the equivalent to a prime minister, and he was the vizier to a pharaoh called Djoser, and Djoser was the builder of the first pyramid, which was the Step Pyramid, which is found in Saqqara, just opposite Cairo. And that pyramid was the first monument in the world made of stone.
Wow.
I don't agree with his name being a bad choice for the character, because if you rise to be the high priest in Karnak, then I think you need to be doing something right, and you also probably need to come from a good family. And also, again, I think that the name has to be recognizable, and beyond Egyptologists, I think Imhotep is quite a powerful name. And so I don't really have an issue with that, because, priests were called Imhotep back then, priests were called all sorts of names. And it is like a parent calling their child Paul or Peter or something like that. It's exactly the same type of thing. Parents called their child based on positive, in this case, male figures. So I would take issue with his costume, though. If he is Keeper of the Dead, then he shouldn't be there, because the Keeper of the Dead refers to Anubis, and I think we're going to be coming back to him again and again. But his place would be in the mortuary, not in the temple. So I don't know if that's a slight slip in the script there. If he is Seti's high priest, that would mean that he is the chief priest of Amun of Karnak. And if he was that, then he should be wearing a leopard skin with white linen.
Interesting.
However, I think that the shaved head is accurate, and there is no body hair. That was accurate. And I think that his presence in the palace, though, I think is a strange one. And when Seti walks in and he says, "What are you doing here?" that actually has a wider meaning, because in Thebes there was a constant power struggle between the pharaoh and the priests of Amun. So Karnak, which is the main temple of Amun in Thebes, you have to imagine it like a Vatican City inside Rome. So you have to imagine it as its own type of mini kingdom, and it operated very similarly to the way that the medieval Catholic Church operated in Europe. It owned land, it owned tenants, and it had power to rival that of the pharaoh. And so the pharaoh and the priest would have like a demarcation line. And then during festivals, such as the festival of Opet, where the three gods of Thebes would be moved from the temple of Amun to the temple of the king in Luxor, the king would be on the one side, the priest would be on the other. So I am not sure whether I've read too much into it, or that's what the screenwriter intended. But I think for me, it's job done with that part.
Good. So, having mentioned Imhotep, I think we can progress through the story a little bit now, because I think we have
Sure.
all the main characters of the prologue laid out. We have Imhotep, Pharaoh Seti, and Anck-su-namun. And I think at the core of the story of the mummy, it's, interestingly enough, a love story between Imhotep and Anck-su-namun, a forbidden love between them, because she is the pharaoh's mistress, and they even say in the prologue, nobody, no other man is allowed to touch her. And their love is so powerful and so strong that they decide to kill the pharaoh. And that is what sets off the chain of events that we see unfold in the rest of the film. Because they kill the pharaoh, and Anck-su-namun then kills herself, if I'm remembering correctly, because they are being cornered by the pharaoh's bodyguards.
The Magi, yes.
The Magi, yes. And then Imhotep goes on a quest to resurrect Anck-su-namun. Remind me, where does Imhotep lead his priests to when they go to do the resurrection ritual?
So they go to a fictional city in the desert called Hamunaptra. And so in my view, I think it's a loose incarnation of the City of the Dead, which is a real place in Saqqara, opposite Cairo, which I mentioned in regards to the first pyramid, which, just so viewers know, is still being excavated, and
Wow.
and new discoveries are still being made. So there are snippets in certain news journals every few months, but it is something which is really exciting, which they keep finding.
Fascinating.
But I just want to before that point, before they get to Hamunaptra, I do want to say that killing a pharaoh, while yes, it was a great crime, it also wasn't unheard of. And so there is a great amount of speculation over how Tutankhamun died, whether it was the famous blow in the back of the head, or whether he fell off a chariot, or whether he died from something else. But also a pharaoh called Ramesses III, about 100 plus years later from the events here in question, he died from either a cut to the throat, or by a different slash wound, or by poison, or also maybe something else. He defeated the Sea Peoples who had destroyed the Hittite Empire to the north, but because a member of his harem, mistress, funnily enough, wanted her son to be pharaoh, but he wasn't in the direct line of succession, she formed a plot to kill him. The plot worked, but also the plot was found out. And just to preempt what you are going to ask about, the punishment for regicide was some of the plotters had to commit suicide in front of the court, and the rest were impaled on stakes and left to die. Sometimes you could be thrown to the crocodiles, and other times you could just have your head lopped off. But that was probably in rare cases. And it did depend on who was the pharaoh, who was in charge, and what time period you're asking me.
Interesting. So let me ask you this then, since we're on this, on the subject of execution, and this relates to the story. They go to Hamunaptra. Imhotep, is about to resurrect Anck-su-namun, but then the Magi, am I saying it correctly?
Correct.
The Magi show up and stop him from resurrecting her. And as punishment, the priests are sentenced to be mummified alive. And I was wondering if that was something that people had to endure. Is that historically accurate?
No. And it is a complete falsehood. What I would say, starting on something positive, is I think that the attempted resurrection scene, brilliant. I absolutely loved how the soul rose from the pool and went to the body.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a fantastic visual from how a soul coming from the underworld works. And for me, that is brilliant. And also, I think it does convey very well where the soul goes. And going back to your question about being mummified alive, being mummified was a very expensive undertaking. Most ancient Egyptians could never afford it. Only the most wealthy and the pharaoh could afford it. And of those, there were then different levels of what type of mummification you could have. At the very low end, your body was just wrapped in bandages and you were put in the ground. On the far end, your body had the organs taken out and it was soaked in natron salt for 70 days.
Long time.
No, less than that. 40 days. It's either 40 days or 70 days. Shocking from me. Shocking. And in that time, you had to pay the priests and the embalmers to do their jobs. Linen was expensive, as was the chemicals that were needed to dry out your body and preserve your body. And also on top of that, you had coffins, you had tombs, you had Book of the Dead, which we'll come on to a bit later. Spending all that money for criminals just didn't happen. Being Mummified Alive is absolutely fantastic cinema. And I think it takes its inspiration from the 1959 film where the character Karis, the guardian of Princess Ananka's tomb, he was mummified and entombed alive to be the eternal protector of the princess. I just would like to just make one more comment on the resurrection scene.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think to most Egyptologists, they would say, why is he trying to bring her back from the afterlife? And so I call it a reverse resurrection, where he's bringing her back to the mortal world. The reason he's doing that is because Anaxunamun committed a crime to which she would either cease to exist or she would burn in hellfire. And it does have its origins in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, where that was the punishment if you didn't know the name of the god for whose door you had to pass through, because there were several gates that you had to pass through and you had to have the right answer. And so you were asked a series of riddles. And if you failed, that was your punishment. And so you would continue to exist, but you would be suffering the whole time, very similar to what our version of hell is right now.
Right, right. Well, that's fascinating. So, Anaxunamun, having committed a terrible crime, may not have ended up in the afterlife after all, I suppose. So maybe him bringing her back was not only an act of him wanting to be with her, in life, but perhaps he was saving her from a terrible fate or whatever might have awaited her after death, in his belief. Does that question
He
make
would
sense?
know that as well. Yeah.
Okay.
And also, yeah, he would know that. And so I'm not sure, because the movie doesn't dig deeper than this, I am not sure, and if he had the answer to whether they could avoid that fate forever. But I don't think Imhotep was thinking long term with what he was doing. But I know that he was acting under the knowledge that there was a threat to Anaxunamun's soul and she may lose it forever. So I get...
Interesting.
The only thing I don't understand is when her body is on the altar or table, why it looks like she's just died, because the narrator says that they took her body from her crypt. So that tells me that she's been buried.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, she should be dried out completely, so she looks like a prune, basically, and she probably would have lost about a third of her weight, if not more. But I think probably this was a creative decision just to make it look a bit more easy on the eye, maybe.
Sure, yeah.
And also, I think it's something I do, and if I was director as well, I don't think people need to see what happens when you're that far gone.
Right. All right, fascinating stuff. So, yeah, they are caught, and they being Imhotep and his priests are not able to complete the resurrection ritual. So As mentioned, the priests are condemned to be mummified alive, and Imhotep has to endure the Hamdai, I believe they call it, which is a terrible curse to be essentially living dead.
So the Hamdai is a complete fictional invention. I think it's a very good fictional invention, personally. I think it's brilliant to add the threat for the rest of the movie, so I do have to add kudos to the screenwriter for that. So in it, they cut out his tongue, they mummify him alive, and they say that he will never rest and that his name's extinguished and he's eaten alive by scarabs, isn't he?
Right.
So curses were real in ancient Egypt, or at least the belief in them was, but just not on the same scale. So a typical curse is actually quite rare, and they were written in a sort of legalese. So it was like a warning to say, please don't do this, don't walk on the grass. It's, something that simple, but that kind of thing.
Right.
And there was the implicit fear Egyptians had of angering the gods or that person by doing it, because the Egyptians believed that ghosts came back to haunt them and give them bad luck. And the Egyptians believed in demons, and if you were to mess with the wrong things. But curses on that scale didn't happen. And just one last thing,
of course,
before we move on to 1922. Just so the viewers know, the Magi were real. And also, I think their casting was spot on, because they weren't a bunch of white guys dressed in Egyptian clothes. They were actually looked, Northeast African, which I think was really good. They were originally a desert Bedouin people who dwelt in the eastern Egyptian desert between the Nile and the Red Sea. And they went on in the New Kingdom, where this prologue is set, to be the elite military police force. So they were, in effect, the Praetorian Guard of ancient Egypt. And so their use in this film, their weapons were spot on. And I think that the creative team needs to be given a lot of credit for that.
That's fantastic. I had no idea they were real. That's so cool. Okay, so yeah, in terms of the story of the film, that's the prologue. It ends with Imhotep becoming the mummy, and we are brought to, I think you said 1922. It's the 20s, and the first thing we see is the battle in, is it Hamunaptra?
Yes.
And we are introduced to Brendan Fraser's character, Rick O'Connell, who is in the French Foreign Legion, I want to say.
Yes. I've got an issue with this. The French Foreign Legion were never in Egypt. Speaking as a British person, if the French did set foot in Egypt, the British Foreign Office would have a fit. But I think it's one of the highlights of the film, as it's so well done, and the amount of extras must have been incredible.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a fantastic scene, a fantastic battle.
And the scene definitely serves its purpose, because this is where Rick discovers that, oh, this is actually Hamunaptra.
I think that he is fighting for his life. I'm not sure he's aware of where he is.
Gotcha.
However, he does later say that, I think it was to Evie, that his whole regiment marched into Egypt to find it. And then also Benny says that he never believed in it, but I think at the time he was more concerned with self-preservation, because he was chased by Bedouins. They flee when the voice from the statue starts going, and then the sand trick starts, which again I think is really good.
Gotcha. Okay. And after this battle sequence, we are introduced to Evie and Jonathan. And Evie is, I would say, an aspiring Egyptologist who was working as a librarian. And what does Jonathan do?
Honestly, I think he's a bit of a chancer. I think that he's a bit of a... I'm not sure really, but I would say he's a failed academic, or he's a lapsed academic, and he is what you call a con man, probably, or
Okay.
that sort of thing. I think Evie was the victim of probably a lot of sexist attitudes, which were very prevalent back then. And
Hmm.
so I'm assuming that when the term Ben Bris College is mentioned, which I am sorry to say is not real, but it is a real private school in England, if anyone cares. But yeah, I think she's just the victim of circumstance and of her gender, unfortunately. However, I think the bookcase scene is brilliant, if you want to come on to that.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I read that whole sequence where she is on the ladder and the bookcases all fall like, dominoes. They managed to get that in one take. So the
No,
crew,
really?
yeah, yeah,
Wow.
the crew did not have to reset and do it again. They managed to do it the first take. So that's a fun little tidbit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um, that's really good. I think she gets given a scolding by. Does he have a name, or is he just called the curator? I have watched this film so many times. I don't pay attention to some names. It's really a bad
He
habit.
has a name. I did not write it down on my notebook, which is sitting right next to me. That's why I'm glancing over every now and again to just check my notes. But he does have a name. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me right now. But he is given a name in the film.
Yeah, I think that the references to the plagues of Egypt, I think, was quite interesting, and this is something we can tackle now. I think it's also going for a pop culture reference again, in the sense that everyone knows what the plagues of Egypt are, or
Right.
because we are still in a Judeo-Christian culture, and therefore a lot of our formative years are spent learning about the Bible. Fun fact, though, the plagues didn't happen until 20 years after Seti died. So it's actually quite interesting.
Really? Huh. Okay.
And so while the timeline is quite out, I do understand why that phrase was mentioned, because if someone thinks of Egypt in the top 10, you're going to think of the plagues. And just one last thing on this point before we move on. Ramesses didn't destroy Syria. It's an oversimplification. What you had was a Berlin Wall type situation where Ramesses had half of Syria and the Hittites had half of Syria. And also, at the time, Syria wasn't even a country. And so I'm not sure where the reference comes from. But
Huh.
I just wanted to make that point.
Very interesting indeed. Okay, so we are, as I mentioned, we're introduced to Evie and Jonathan produces the key to the Book of the Dead, although they don't know that that's what it's for at the time.
Just one point,
Yeah,
and
go
I'll
ahead.
be very brief. Never mess with a mummy like he messed with a mummy. They are
Right.
thousands of years old. Do not mess with them, because if you break them, that's just don't. Not cool.
He crawled into the coffin, sarcophagus,
Yes.
whatever, and had his arm around the mummy and used it to scare Evie when she walked by. Yeah, that's a big no-no.
Just to say that, and if anyone goes to Egypt and tries that, they will arrest you and they will put you in prison. Don't do it.
Duly noted.
It's just a practical joke which will get you a big fine or put in a prison which you really don't want to be in. It's actually a crime, I think.
Wow. Okay. But yeah, so he gets the key to the Book of the Dead. Says he did he say he stole it from Rick, or that he won it from Rick? I can't remember the circumstances exactly.
He found it on a dig in Thieves, which was a lie.
Yes.
And
Yes. Okay.
And then he later confesses to Evie off screen that he stole it from Rick, who was in Cairo prison.
And then they go to Cairo prison to seek Rick out. And Rick is about to be executed. Evie tries to get some answers out of Rick, and Rick is saying, "Hey, you want my help? Get me out of here." Then he's taken away to be hung, and Evie starts bartering with the warden of the prison, and she's like, "I will pay you to spare this man's life." And he says, "I would pay to watch him hang." So ultimately, she does get him to say, the warden to say, okay, we'll let him go, but I want, a cut of whatever you guys, find if you make it to Hamunaptra. So Rick is freed just in the nick of time. But yeah, now the adventure begins. This is where we kind of get into what I would call the Indiana Jones territory, because we have our main characters setting out on, essentially a treasure hunt, but in this case, the treasure would be, the city of Hamunaptra and all the artifacts that lie within. And we learn that good old Benny, who I believe we met in the battle sequence earlier on in the film, is leading a separate expedition. And the main characters, Evie, Jonathan, and Rick, bump into Benny. They cross paths with him and his people. And there's a rather funny sequence with Rick throwing Benny over the side of the boat, I want to say. Benny's a fun character. I really enjoy his performance. And yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else of note that takes place during the journey to Hamunaptra.
I'd like to add a couple of things, if that's possible.
Absolutely. Go right ahead.
I am not sure why there was the stereotyping of the Americans as cowboys. I thought that was a bit unfair. I don't recommend anyone jump in the Nile, because at the time you had crocodiles in there, you have electric catfish who would give you a very nasty shock. Wow. And also the current is quite strong. So, and if you do think it's a good idea no, don't. But on the boat, no, I would say that is pretty accurate, just in the sense of the scene and all the references. Yeah, I think it's a good scene. I think it also sets up Evie and Rick's love story better, because now there's interest on her part.
Absolutely. And I forgot to mention that the Magi. I'm going to have a really difficult time saying this for some reason.
The second one.
Magi.
Yes.
Don't they show up on the ship as well?
Yeah, they do. I am not sure how they found them, but I will let that go. I just love the pure mindless violence. Then it's just one of those.
It's a great action sequence.
Yeah, I think it's that part of the film where you just like seeing people with guns and shooting, and it's just nice escapism.
Absolutely, absolutely. It reminded me of a scene from, again, sorry to keep bringing this up, but Indiana Jones, one of the Indiana Jones films, just a good gunfight. And yeah, ultimately the main characters end up in Hamunaptra, and this is where I wanted to ask you if you could explain the difference between the two books that are used or featured in this story, one of them being the Book of the Dead and the other being the Book of Amun-Ra, because they find the Book of the Dead first in Hamunaptra.
Wow, that is a very big question. First, I would like to say is that scene where they wait for the sunrise to rise over Hamunaptra, that is a fantastic scene. And that is my most favourite of the whole film. I think that the effects there were fantastic. So the Book of the Dead was real. The Book of Amun-Ra was not real. So firstly, the Book of the Dead. So they find that after the diggers were melted by salt acid. So first off, booby traps like that didn't exist. The most that the Egyptians did to put off tomb robbers was to build false rooms, false doors. And an example in Seti, the first tomb, is that there's like a pit which then blocks off access to the burial chamber from the main corridor. So if you fall into that without a ladder, then you are staying there. And so they find the Book of the Dead, but the Book of the Dead itself, I think it's a great movie prop, but a Book of the Dead didn't look like that. And I think I think that for pure functionality reasons, they had to make it something like a book, something like that, because Book of the Dead was a very long scroll, and it could be as short as 1 meter. It could be as long as 40 meters.
Wow.
So a Book of the Dead was an individualized set of magic spells and directions for you personally to get to the afterlife. And Egyptians saved over a lifetime to buy one. And it was a, luxury item. So, each Book of the Dead you can't use for someone else, say, as in, that Book of the Dead was for you. So how they use it then later on, which we can come to the resurrection of Imhotep later on. But the Egyptians never called it the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians saw it as just a sort of scroll of magical spells. That is how they saw it. So the Book of Amun-Ra is fake. Sorry, guys, it's fake, completely fake. I think it was inserted as a counterweight to the power of Imhotep. And it actually has quite an interesting connotation when it's used, as when Jonathan reads the cover much later on, he invokes the mummies of soldiers, secular enforcers of the pharaoh. And so what I was talking about before with the power difference between the priest and the pharaoh, I'm pretty sure that the writer must have had this in mind, because there's always a separation of power. And I think it's interesting how the Book of Amun-Ra is used. Yes, it is false, but I think that the wider use of it, I think, is also really interesting.
Definitely. And the Book of Amun-Ra doesn't come in to play until, I think, the very end of the film. But I wanted to bring it up now because this is the part in the story where we are introduced to the Book of the Dead. And I know that the film features, the two books. I knew that one was real and one wasn't. And I just wanted to, get your thoughts on, or not get your thoughts, but I wanted to hear you, kind of explain to us, what they were, at least what the Book of the Dead was, and what it was used for. So I thought that was a good opportunity to kind of just mention the forthcoming Book of Amun-Ra. But yeah, thank you for that. So the Book of the Dead is, I believe, found by the opposing team, the Cowboys, if you will, and Evie steals it in the night and decides to read from it. And by reading from it, she ultimately awakens Imhotep. Yeah, we are then introduced to the mummy, which is where the horror comes into play in this film.
So if I just rewind back to where Evie reads the book.
Sure, yeah.
I have a theory, and once again, I'm pretty sure the screenwriter probably had the same one, is that when she spoke, she did mention his name, whether or not it was audible, because in the second film, they definitely make it audible. So I think that the screenwriter researched what they called the opening of the mouth ceremony, which was when a corpse was mummified, the Egyptians believe that your senses needed to be switched back on, say, for them to work in the afterlife. So you had to be, by magical spell, be allowed to breathe again, and you had to be able to hear, you had to be able to touch, and of course, what we come to later on, you had to be able to see, and you had to also be able to taste with your tongue. And as we find out later on, is that the first thing Imhotep does is rip out someone's eyes and tongue. Whether that is right, I don't know, but the opening of the mouth is what happened immediately when a mummy was ready to be buried. So it was intended to kickstart the dead person into the afterlife. So that person had like what's the correct phrase? The equivalent of an avatar in the afterlife. And so it was their body but they had to have their senses working, which could only work if their whole body had that magical spell to enable those senses to work. So I'm assuming that's what's in a loose way been shown here, which I think works very well. If we pick up his sarcophagus first, just very quickly. So for those of you who don't know, a sarcophagus in the ancient Greek translation means a flesh-eating box, which I think is quite gruesome, but I think is technically accurate. So as they discovered, his name was chiseled off, and that had an historical precedence. So in 1907, in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings, a mummy's coffin was discovered whose identifying marks were chiseled off. And they opened the coffin and saw a mummy inside, and on the bandages there was a rough reference to Akhenaten, the father of Tutankhamun, before the body kind of went up in dust, as in what happens to bodies that aren't properly preserved, just crumble.
Right.
And that is kind of what happens. So it's not universally accepted that that's the identity of the mummy, but it is widely believed that it is. The point here is that Akhenaten was accused by later Egyptians of blasphemy and the worst crimes by abandoning the gods, and so he was condemned to be forgotten and his soul to wither because no one knew his name. And also inside his coffin, Imhotep chisels "Death is only the beginning," which actually is a really good proverb for the whole worldview of ancient Egypt, is that life was only a tiny stage of what the main event was, which was the afterlife, and your real life was the afterlife. So when you died, your real life began. So I think that's really good from the writer there, personally.
Please forgive me if I'm jumping too far ahead in the story, but doesn't he release the 10 plagues of Egypt again?
I think he does. I think on screen we don't see all of them. So at the start we see locusts, which are a proper plague, and ones which in ancient Egypt did cause famine. And you saw the hail, which I thought was a bit too much when you saw, meteorites coming down, hitting Cairo. I'm not quite sure that was great. And you had the water was as blood. And this is an interesting one. And I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to some of these literal interpretations of the Bible. Before the Nasser Dam was built, you had the annual Nile flood. And what would happen is that the Nile would turn red during the inundation purely because of the minerals and silt that were being brought through the flood. And it did cause the river to turn red, and it can be misinterpreted. However, for purposes of entertainment, I think it works again. Then I think it leads us quite well then to Imhotep's only fear at this point, and that's cats. And now there's a white cat who is featured twice in the film, which I think does its job brilliantly well. Mm-hmm. And the claim that they are guardians of the underworld is more or less true. So cats in ancient Egypt were treated very well, and they were seen to be guardians of the home because that is where they spent their time, as they do now. And cats were buried with their masters or mistresses when they died, and they were, wrapped and given a proper funeral and everything. And they were seen as protectors in the underworld as well. And there are stories of cats helping the ultimate sun god Ra defeat a giant snake called Apep in the underworld, which was one of the most powerful demons. And again, I think it's a good reference.
Yeah, that's some pretty cool stuff. Imhotep in the story is becoming more and more like his old self as he, progresses on this journey to, collect, for lack of a better term, body parts. And important to note that, because we mentioned Benny earlier, Benny has been recruited by Imhotep for devious purposes. And it's also important to mention, I know we're kind of breezing through the story at this point, but I feel like for viewers out there who are watching this, you've probably already seen the movie The Mummy, and you are probably here to get, more knowledge of ancient Egypt than you are to get knowledge about the film itself. But Imhotep has developed a fascination with Evie that I never fully understood. Correct me if I'm misremembering this, Adam, but doesn't he see her and start saying the name Anck-su-namun? It almost looks like he mistakes her for Anck-su-namun, unless I'm misremembering. Do you recall what I'm talking about?
I think what's happening is that I think there has to be a link to his longer term goal, which is to bring his girlfriend back. So I think it's probably a case of that the writer had to have a way of establishing a relationship without introductions, because we know who the characters are already. And if I was writing the script, that is what I'd do. I think that they say so much without having to tell us. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
And so I think it is a deliberate play on words to keep us in the lurch about what's going to happen and what he wants to happen. I do want to tell the viewer's mind that human sacrifice didn't happen at this time, and definitely wasn't used in this sort of way where it was kind of like a tokenistic way where, one life for another. Human sacrifice in ancient Egypt happens at the start of the civilization and died out after a couple of hundred years. I think for that whole story arc, I think it's a bit of Hollywood's just, an eye for an eye kind of thing.
Right.
And personally, I do think it works, just because it adds that threat of harm. But I don't know where that rat came from. How that rat wasn't taken by the scarabs, and how it's, survived where there's a city with no water. I don't understand how it survived. I know food, but...
Yeah, that is a really good point, yeah.
However, I do know that many people have a phobia of rats, and that's probably why.
They had to throw it in there, right?
Yeah.
To make people feel unsettled.
Yeah, I do agree. But also around that time, just before the sacrifice scene, I do want to give a shout out to the sandstorm scene, and also the scene with the treasure chamber as well.
Right.
Fantastic visuals. I got to say, it's great cinema, and that is what you want. I think for me, they do stand out purely because, especially with the sandstorm, is that you have a story going on within the effects. It isn't just something which we look at and go, oh, wow, is that great? It's actually a story going on within it. And right. I think that Winston's character nailed on. At the time, the Royal Air Force didn't exist. It was the Royal Flying Corps or the Royal Air Corps. I think it was one of them. So actually, they were right in how they portrayed him. I'm not quite sure why he's on an airfield by himself in Egypt, but once again, I'll let that go.
So, okay, yeah. So, as I said before, I feel like, again, if you're watching this, you are already familiar with the film, so I don't think I need to harp on the story too much, but let's kind of just go to the ending then, to the part where Imhotep we spoke about the human sacrifice, where he is attempting to once again resurrect Anck-su-namun by sacrificing Evie, and Jonathan and Rick, with the help of the pilot, come to save her, and we have this just incredible, action-packed ending where the servants of Imhotep come to life in incredibly creepy fashion. Tell me about the weaponry, the armor, whatnot of these minions. Assuming I'm describing them correctly, were they accurate? Like, would the soldiers of that time period have had swords like that?
Well, they had sickle swords, which I think is pretty spot on.
Okay.
They also had spears as well. What I liked and also what was a nice detail was on their shields they had the face of a hawk. or a falcon, whichever you want to. And that's interesting. The power of the pharaoh was represented through the hawk, as the god Horus was the god of the pharaohs. Horus the hawk was the protector of Egypt. And on the front of their shields, it was really interesting. The power of the pharaoh was there in defiance of the power of the priests and their own form of violence. And until the inscription was finished, those soldiers didn't have a direction. But then once the power of the Book of Amun-Ra, or the power of the pharaoh, was established, and then they fought against the priests.
Yeah, you brought up the Book of Amun-Ra. I totally forgot. We're at the point in the story where that book comes into play. Don't Jonathan and Rick find it beneath a statue of
Horus?
Horus. I was going to say Anubis, but
yes.
No, Horus. Okay.
Something I would like to add, though, for the Book of Amun-Ra at the end, and I actually did research this last night, is I wanted to make sure before I said it, the spoken Egyptian used by Evie, by Imhotep, and by Jonathan, the director did actually consult with Egyptologists over the spoken Egyptian, and to my knowledge, it is accurate. I did look up last night what the bird, a stork, meant, but there are about 3 different versions. So what they said is actually really good, and to be honest, I do like that little detail as well, that it isn't a made-up language. It actually was done in consultation with Egyptologists.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. I love when movies do that, when they try to make, languages as accurate as possible. But yeah, Imhotep, the mummy, is defeated when Evie, I believe it's Evie, reads from the Book of Amun-Ra and makes him mortal, allowing Rick to kill him with a sword. And he is, we are treated to a couple of very interesting shots. One of them being where, when Evie makes him mortal, a kind of like a ghost chariot or something appears and passes by Imhotep, and we see maybe his immortal soul sucked away from his body. It's a rather interesting shot, very artistic. And then when he is killed by Rick, his body is taken down below the waters, I want to say, of the pool by the souls that reside there. Am I remembering it correctly?
I think you are remembering it perfectly. So the chariot, I'm not 100% on who the identity is, because the only other chariot user apart from Imhotep in the film was Seti. And I do like to think that, Seti was getting his own back by going through him and taking his soul away from him.
Right, yeah.
I don't know if that's true. I think I'd like that to be true, but I don't know. And with the pool, what's interesting, and I am referring to the 1959 version again, how the mummy was defeated in that film was that he was led to a bog, basically, or like a quicksink in mud where he was trapped. And after the police put some rounds into him, he sank into the mud and he was defeated. Whether that had any
maybe
whether that had an impact on the later story, I don't know, but there are similarities. I think it works, and I think that the quote he says again, "Death is only the beginning," I think works. And so he's taken into the underworld, which I think is good to point out this time, is that now he has suffered that curse, he's come back, but now he's died again. Does he now enter the underworld as a mortal person rather than someone cursed, or does he return to the underworld as he was before? I think it's an interesting question, but personally I think it's what every good writer does, and leaves that room open for the sequel.
Absolutely.
Which I think has probably happened.
Yeah, although it does seem... I do wonder if they intended on making a sequel back when they made this film, because his demise seems a bit, seems very final, like If I was watching this film for the first time when it first came out, I was rather young when it came out and didn't have the opportunity to, see it immediately. Um, I would not guess that there would be a sequel with the same villain, you know?
I would agree if they hadn't lost the books.
Right, right.
If they had the books in their possession, I would say fair enough. They had the power of life and death, so there is no point. I think that The Mummy is a very good standalone film.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think I've watched it too many times, and so I think I see those little links. Because I think that the art of a very good screenwriter is to have your complete standalone story, but always have that wiggle room as well, so it can, work as one story, but it can work as being two. But that is my view, and
Gotcha.
I think it was done very well.
Yeah, okay, definitely. It's been a while since I've seen the sequel. Hopefully, we can discuss that in time as well. And I look forward to watching it. Again, I've only seen it once, and that was quite a few years ago. So I look forward to revisiting that film. But back to this film. It ends as you would expect. Benny bites the dust. Rick gets the girl, and they ride off into the sunset, happy and ready for a new adventure. So,
Did they know that camel had the gold on it? Out of all the camels, and I counted at least 12. Out of all the camels, did they know? And also, what happened to the rest of the camels? But,
good question.
I think it's one of those, but I do think it's one of those nice little, pat on the back kind of things for a good job that they, leave richer than when they found it.
Right.
Like I said, I think it does end well. I think you have a complete ending. And again, I am not sure how, what's his name?
Ardith Bay.
That's right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how he survived, but then again, with the, fighting power of those
priests. Don't we see him basically die when he charges into that horde of like mummy minions? Like, it looks like he's not going to make it. Yeah.
But you know what? And I don't mind a plot fail sometimes if they work. And that was one of those plot fails that works. So I don't mind that. It's just, I think there are some characters that you can afford to lose and, no one asks any questions. This is one where you're like, and it's a shame because in the deleted scenes, they don't have any reference to it, which is a shame.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think it's just one of those things we are just going to be left wondering. So, never mind.
Nice. Well, yeah, like I said, I hope we can discuss The Mummy Returns at some point. But this was a fun film to rewatch. I had a fun time talking about it, and I learned a lot from you. Thank you for imparting your knowledge of ancient Egypt and how it pertains to the mummy on me and the viewers. That was awesome.
Absolutely, no problem. But there is something I would like to add as well, is that
of course.
I think that YouTube is flush with videos now saying about how bad the movie is, what's wrong. I've said a few things about what isn't historically accurate, but I also hope I've said a lot of things that are right and what do work, and also what is important.
Right.
And this is something I think Egypt experts, people like me, need to do more often. We need to say how well a piece of media gets an ordinary person interested in ancient Egypt, because engagement is so crucial, and also for Egypt, the country, tourism is so crucial. To pay for the upkeep of antiquities, Egypt's taxes, a lot of their revenue comes from tourism, and also in different museums around the world, and engagement, donations, things like that. What's important, not saying how bad media gets it, what we should be saying is, how does it get more people interested? How does it get more people committing their time to the upkeep of antiquities and learning about history the way that it should be? and that is that history is a great subject, but one that needs to be protected from those that don't always say it right.
Okay.
However, that is a different conversation for a different day. But what I would like to say, though, is that I understand that there is an urge to say what's wrong, and there is an urge to criticize all media. But the purpose of a movie, like I said at the top, is to entertain and to also make money for a studio to then pay for more films. What it is not is a history book. And what's important is that if you see a movie that has Egypt references, has references to other historical facts, it prompts you to go and read more books. It prompts you to go and educate yourself. That is what a movie should do. And hopefully when viewers watching this, if you have heard something I've said, and if you disagree, if you want to fact check me, I encourage you to do it. Go and read books. Go and tell me why I'm wrong. But also, most importantly, tell me why I'm wrong based on evidence that you found. And I'll be more than happy to have that conversation. And that is what I hope happens for more people more often.
Well said, Adam. Yeah. This is a film that makes me want to learn more about ancient Egypt, especially having spoken to you about it now. Growing up, I was very interested in ancient Egypt, but in my teenage years, I kind of fell off the train a little bit when it came to researching it and studying it. But what you said just now is very inspiring and makes me want to kind of revisit that interest a little bit more. So, yeah, thank you for that.
No problem at all.
Well, I want to thank you as well for joining me on this Saga session. This was a blast. I've said it a couple of times now, but I look forward to the opportunity to discuss more mummy movies with you. And
Absolutely great.
Yeah, I can't wait for that. And to everybody watching this, thank you so much for attending this Saga session. Adam and I hope to see you again soon. And don't forget to check out Adam's channel, The Ancient Egyptian. I will put a link to it in the video description. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.